Welcome to the Wokelandia podcast, where we are exposing the injustice in social justice. We're your hosts, the Back Home Brothers. I'm Caleb.
And I'm Joseph. Good to see you guys today.
Thanks for being on the podcast.
We got a
doozy today. We got a doozy. Now, Ben Carson, you want to introduce it here, and then we'll jump into it.
The question of the day today is, in Wokelandia, when are Black people bad? And we have found when Black people are bad.
It should be never.
And the story that we are going to cover today has to do with Ben Carson High School in Detroit. And they have decided to change the name of Ben Carson High School to not be Ben Carson High School. I don't know that I've heard what it's going to be. We just know that's not what it's going to be, correct?
Yes, and it's not just Ben Carson High School. It's Benjamin Carson High School of Science and Medicine, which is fitting enough and it's in Detroit. He's probably, I don't know, maybe not the most famous neurosurgeon out of Detroit, but quite
neurosurgeon out of Detroit, probably neurosurgeon in the world. I mean, can you name another neurosurgeon?
Not right off. Yeah,
exactly. Right. Neurosurgeons are not typically household names. Ben Carson is, was, I think, what he was most famous for, and he's done a lot of impressive things, but for separating conjoined twins who were joined at the brain, right? So they were connected at the brain, separated the brains. They survived. Really big scientific accomplishment. He also has an amazing story of just growing up in poverty, single-headed home, illiterate mother who still kind of pushed him into learning and reading, and obviously became very successful academically. You don't become a brain surgeon without having some academic ability.
He wrote a book, Gifted Hands. I think it was called Gifted Hands. Was well received, and he operated on a child at least once inside the womb, maybe more than once. Just amazing.
So these are all good things.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't got to the bad things because we've just changed the name, right? Because again, we're in the context of Wokelandia. What are the rules of wokeness in Wokelandia? And again, renaming schools is not exactly a brand new thing in Wokelandia. We've been renaming schools for a while, right? Thomas Jefferson has had his name scrubbed. Portland, they did or tried to scrub Abraham Lincoln's name from schools. We've been removing the name of white people from elementary schools, from public schools for a while.
We should say this whole story should come from our game, or you'd think we took our game from the story, but we didn't. Our game came first, and this card, I'm going to show several cards today.
Well, let's before we get there, let's set
this is what you're saying.
Yes, this is what we're talking about, right? So we've been renaming schools for a while. Part of what happens in Wokelandia is nobody from history is good if they did something bad, right? So we've been scrubbing people, white people, generally because of their perceived or actual connection to racism. In some cases, those who had slaves, right? So we know that our founding fathers, some of them were slave owners. And so we've said we can no longer honor and recognize the good things that they did in life because they were racist. And of course, there's a bit of presentism involved there, where we are judging past generations by the standards of the current generation. Whether that's appropriate or not is a really good, interesting question. I'm inclined to think that's not entirely fair, right? Because how are future generations going to judge people who have really good motives today, but are doing things that future generations will consider to be awful? I actually think abortion is going to end up falling into that category, right? Where we look back and say, how could you do that? Right now, that's how we feel about racism and slavery. At that point, it was just normal because every country on earth basically had slaves. This was just the way things were. We now look at that and we're horrified and say, how could you have done that, right? So we've been scrubbing the names of white people because of their connection to racism and to slavery for quite a while. That being said, Ben Carson is not guilty of being a slave owner, right? I don't even think he's been accused of being racist. So
he's not even in favor of slavery, from what I've understood. Doesn't
From
even
what I
favor.
understand,
Yeah.
that is true.
He's an
Not even in.
anti-slavery guy.
So, Caleb, why are
But
we removing black people from public high schools as well?
well, we're removing him because he is not staying in line.
Is he the wrong kind of black person?
That is a part of the game. And just like this card here in the game says my child's elementary school was named after a white man, not anymore. You get a virtue signal for that. You can see the card here. You get a virtual signal for that. And this is for a white man. But now this guy.
If you are joining us for the first time, and again,
white.
let's catch people up who might be catching us for the first time, because
they
again,
know what the game is.
Our audience is exploding every single episode. We get at least like 4 more people every single time. Yeah. But Wokelandia, the podcast, is brought to you by Wokelandia, the game. Actually, the game was the first idea, and where we have put the rules of wokeness in a game. You can find it on Amazon today at wokelandia.com. Right, but one of the cards that we have in there. In the rules of wokeness, and this is the rules of the game, and what we're trying to catch people up on is identity matters tremendously in Wokelandia. It matters more than character. It matters more than competency. It matters more than skill. Do you have the right identity? And we're dealing with different identity categories. We deal with our sexual orientation category. We deal with our gender. We deal with our class. We deal with our political affiliation. And we know
is the card that matters most of all. This is the race card. So let's talk about these real cards. You've got your races, and this one is black. If you can see it on there, the way I have my
we can't read that because
you can't see it, but it's the black card, and it says, which happens to be exactly in line with this story. It says, if you're black, you're not a slave anymore, but you still have to vote Democrat. That's the stipulation with it, and that's exactly the problem with Ben Carson. Is he has lost his way. He is not behaving the way he's expected to behave as a black man, which is a major offense.
Which is kind of ironic, since the whole like notion of we're objecting to slavery and racism is the idea that there is a way that white people can tell black people that they should behave. But in many ways, that is precisely what is happening in the case of Ben Carson, is because he is a conservative. He's on the right, ran for president as a Republican.
Right. And can you imagine, like, I've got some criticisms on here that people have written that I'll read off in a second, but they're basically saying, know your place, boy. And they would never, ever say that because that's highly offensive and racist. But that's exactly what they're doing with different words and different actions. But they just avoid the label, avoid the offensive label, but don't avoid the offensive contents inside the jar of the label. And that is what's going on, is they are upset because he is, and this is the most important card of all, the conservative card. That is a minus 100. And in the game, you will find it doesn't matter what all the other identities, all the identities are really important, especially race, unless you're on the wrong side of the most important identity, which is your politics or your religion. But really, they're oftentimes intertwined. But politics is the big one. He's got the wrong politics card, which makes him persona non grata, no matter what his other cards may be.
People will understand, they will recognize immediately in Wokelandia that the various identity categories, race, religion, and the ones that are good and are bad, right? It's bad to be a white male evangelical in Wokelandia. Everybody recognizes that. It's good to be a black transgender Muslim, whatever, right? Because you're checking these identity category boxes. But the point that you were just alluding to, and this is part of the rules of the game, Wokelandia, but it's also part of the rules of life in Wokelandia, which we're all living in, whether we have the game or not, is that you can check the right categories. You can be black, you can be trans, you can be a lesbian, you can be, an immigrant, all of those things, which you would generally get oppression points for, and you would get social credit for being those things. However, the moment you also identify as a conservative, politically speaking, you lose all the credit that you had previously earned by checking the right boxes. And it basically neutralizes all of the social credit you get in Wokelandia for otherwise checking the right identity categories. All of that is rendered meaningless the moment that you say, but I'm not going to vote for the Democrat. I don't agree that, boys can become girls, whatever whatever kind of principled left-wing position you think that there is, that kind of defines leftism. The moment you reject those principles, it doesn't matter if you're in the right identity categories. You lose all the benefits of being the right thing by virtue of believing the wrong thing. And what that teaches us then is in Wokelandia, really, it's a religion, right? Because these are heresy trials that have been conducted against Ben Carson. And they've said, you, sir, have the wrong religion. We're seeing this right now happen to Elon Musk as well, though he doesn't fit the same categories, although he is African-American, which is ironic because he was actually born in Africa.
That's great.
But he's not black, so whatever. But again, he's actually a pretty good leftist on most policy issues. He's left on a lot
of Democrat. He's
a
just
lot
not
of,
on speech.
lot of issues his whole life, right?
He's just wrong on speech.
But now
that's it.
He violates the left wing, what has become, what's the word I'm looking for?
It demands
axiomatic. It's become, left wing orthodoxy. The idea that we do not tolerate speech that we disagree with because speech is violence. It ruins people's lives. It's a threat to democracy. All of these kind of superlatives we've come up with to say that people who agree with us don't just have a different opinion. They're a threat to life on planet Earth. So we don't tolerate them anymore. Elon Musk rejects that. Therefore, he is persona non grata simply because he believes that ideas should be freely expressed, even if we disagree with them.
And I have to wonder if it's actually worse for Ben Carson because he is black now as a conservative, because he has turned his back on his race.
That's how it's perceived.
The way they would see it. Of course, that isn't true. Black people do not owe any allegiance to any party just because they happen to have more melanin in their skin. But like one of the school board members is quoted as saying, it's basically like Trump in blackface. So if you hate Trump, you're going to hate Ben Carson even more. How could we possibly name our school after Trump, the great Satan? And how much more if Trump had blackface on? That's even more offensive. So here, and that was the reason he gave for objecting to it, was Trump and blackface. And so you look at Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. He's probably the most hated member of the Supreme Court, I would think, by the left.
For sure. And another example of this, a couple of years ago, during the recall election for Gavin Newsom in California, Larry Elder, who lives in California, he's a radio show host. He's a black conservative radio show host. He was kind of running against Gavin in this recall election. And the Los Angeles Times ran this headline that I remember because I've used this in some presentations, and it says, "The new black face of white supremacy." And it had Larry Elder's picture on there, right? So this black guy, the LA Times was saying, is the black face of white supremacy, which of course makes no sense. And part of that just goes to the fact that they don't define racism in the same way that we do. And it doesn't make any sense in the old way of thinking about racism that a black person would be racist. But the way they define racism now is anything that disagrees with the policy preferences that we have is racism. And so if you disagree with us, that's inherently racist, whether you intend to be racist or not, whether you have hate in your heart or not. It's racism because of the outcome.
They would argue that our views are anti-racist. And so if you disagree with us, you're anti-racist, which is the same thing as being a racist.
Racist, correct.
And so just disagreeing with a woke person, with a leftist, is tantamount to racism. No matter who you are or what your life experiences have been, and no matter how many of the boxes that are checked. And it's ironic that a worldview that puts so much weight in these identity classes and says it's so important what your race is, what your sexual identity is, what your gender is, that there's no gender at all. These are really important things. But as soon as a person who checks all those boxes shows up with one thing wrong in the political box or the religious box, but particularly the political one, because it's okay if your religion is private and kept out of the public sphere. Well, as soon as you bring it in, your terrible Judeo-Christian views, bring those into politics, into the realm of power, which is really what it's all about, then you're out. That's the one card that minuses all the other positive points.
Having the wrong political philosophies is worse in Wokelandia than having the wrong religious philosophy, because again, you can identify as an evangelical Christian, and as long as you agree with them politically, they'll hold you up as one of the good Christians, or, you know, Muslims or Catholic, whatever category you want. They don't object, and many of them will claim to be Christians themselves and hold hold religious beliefs in their way of saying, oh, you know, we're not just all progressives, we're not all secularists, right?
And it gives a validity.
We are people of faith
Christian,
also.
And then they go on to talk, you know, as a Christian, I will say that Jesus would never do this or say that. It's like it adds gravitas to the statement, even if it's a total nonsense statement.
Biden says that all the time. Nancy Pelosi goes there often. But the point there is that as long as, and there's a lot of theology behind this, and I always, when we talk about this particular subject, go back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Who were Jews living in Babylon. They knew they were Jews. They did not object to them being Jews and worshiping Yahweh, right? Nebuchadnezzar knew that that was what the situation was. But when he erected that statue, he allowed it, he tolerated it. Because these were all polytheistic cultures. This is the church, this is the culture, the environment, I should say, that Christianity was birthed in the Roman Empire. There were thousands of gods, at least, that people would worship, and you could worship whatever gods you wanted, as long as you also worshiped Caesar, right? That was the thing. And the problem for Christians in the early church was not that they worshiped Jesus, but what was that they said there's no king but Jesus. And that was the offensive part that caused problems with Caesar. That was the problem for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is that their worship of Yahweh forbid them from worshiping the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar demanded that they worship. So you can be Christian of any flavor, you can be any religion, and they'll tolerate it, and they'll even celebrate it. And they'll say, you're one of the good guys, as long as you worship their gods and their idols as well, right? That's what's going on in Wokelandia. And so the reason why it's worse to be conservative than it is to be Christian is because by virtue of your declaration that you're conservative, and you can, of course, be an atheist and be a conservative and they'll hate you just as much, is because you have violated, you have been found guilty in our heresy trials. You do not believe the things that we require you to believe in order to live peacefully in our community. Therefore, we banish you to outer darkness, whatever, however else you identify.
Their power structure. And this whole game really is about power. But the idea that this person has an allegiance to something above our system, and that can't be allowed, above our gods. They wouldn't call it a god, of course, today. That was called that in the past. But again, it's just a label. It doesn't matter. What's inside the jar that the label is on is what matters. And what inside there is a god, is the power structure, is allegiance to our system. If you have allegiance to something greater than that, then that's a threat to what we've got. As long as you have allegiance to us first and foremost, that's okay.
First and foremost, that's right. You can have allegiance to a whole bunch of other things as long as those secondary allegiances are in fact secondary to the political dogma, the political orthodoxy that we have created that you must believe in order to be part of our community. And if you do not agree with those things, we don't care if you're trans, we don't care if you're Muslim, we don't care if you're an illegal immigrant, we don't care if you're poor, we don't care if you're marginalized in every single way and you're black or yellow or brown or whatever color that we think is important for you to be. You can have all of those things, but if in your mind you are not surrendered to the things we tell you are true, you are the enemy and we will treat you like it. That's Wokelandia.
And I want to point out before we end this part of it, that this is racism in and of itself. They claim to be anti-racist, but in fact, I view it as a manipulation to encourage people or almost castigate people who are falling out of line of what they're expected. They don't expect white Christian males to behave well. They just want them to shut up and go away. But everybody else has expectations.
We're going to die off. They're sure of that. Eventually, we will go extinct. The arc of history is making sure that our kind will not even exist in 20 years.
They will die out, and the kids, the new generation, will replace them with utopia. That's the idea of what will happen eventually. But right now, when you look at some of these comments, like Keisha King was on Twitter, and she slammed Democrats for allegedly using race as a manipulation tool, which I think is entirely true. It's a manipulation. Look, they will point to Ben Carson and others other prominent Black conservatives that we've already mentioned and say, look what happens to them when they don't follow the line. when they don't do what they're supposed to do. And you don't want that to happen to you. You want to stay in line. And the idea that they can expect you to do something because of your identity is the same principle behind the idea of racism, is that you are less than me and you must do what you're told because of your skin color. And how they can't see that is just abhorrent. You look at what this is another quote from Dr. Trudy Seivright, I think is how you say it, a Georgia-based obstetrician. And she said she was inspired by his leading example in the medical field. And her quote is, "When I was 12, I read Gifted Hands. I'm an OBGYN because of him," she tweeted. "He was my only example because there were no physicians in my family. I'm surprised that the Black community would shun him solely because he's a Republican. The Be Kind crew strikes again," she says. And that's a great quote. She was inspired by this guy who did amazing and wonderful and good things. Yeah. But now, because he's Black, especially, the community, well, she said the Black community, it's not really the Black community, it's the Black leftist community. Correct. But they are shunning him, particularly because of his race.
And that's an important distinction to make because, right, in Wokelandia, this really is a small percentage of the population that is mad at Ben Carson because he has the wrong politics.
They happen to be on that school
I do
board,
not believe the majority of Black people dislike Ben Carson and want his name scrubbed from buildings and places where he would be honored, right? For the most part, I'm sure most, whether they agree with his politics or not, they respect his story, and the dude has lived a scandal-free life, right? He's even been in politics. I've never even heard like a hint of like Ben Carson mistreats people. Mm-hmm. He's cheated on his taxes. He's cheated on his wife, whatever allegations there hasn't even been a hint of that around this guy. He is in all conceivable ways, as far as we know publicly, a completely honorable, decent, and exceptional, human. But none of that matters. And that goes to the other part where virtue, right? Even despite the fact that he has overcome ridiculous disadvantages in his life, poverty, single father, single parent home, all of these things, to become a world-renowned neurosurgeon. He gets no credit for that. We're not going to honor that. Not because he was a slaveholder, but because he voted for the wrong guy for president. And that really is what it boils down to.
And not just voted for him, he actually worked for him. He was
worked for him too.
In the HUD.
And he was in the administration. Yes.
While Trump was president, which again, he's basically just Trump in blackface. So they got rid of him. Race card didn't count. He's out. The conservative card balances that out, more than balances it out, makes it so he can't win in Wokelandia. And if you have the game, you already know, if you're stuck with this card, no matter the other cards you have, you cannot win in Wokelandia. And Ben Carson this week has proven that point, that he cannot win in Wokelandia until he converts to the proper way of seeing the world according to the woke.
If you don't have the game, go get it. Wokelandia.com. You can get it on Amazon.
It's
and
available.
Follow along because we're basically just saying the news every day.
We got more.
It helps us illustrate.
We got another one to do right now, but I think
where this all comes from.
Next episode.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us.